Imagine a small cluster of huts on a muddy hill overlooking a bend in the Tiber River. There are no marble columns here, no grand palaces, and no golden statues. There is only a group of farmers and shepherds struggling to survive in a landscape of swamps and rival tribes. From these humble roots, an idea was born that would reshape the world. This is not just a story of stones and battles. It is a story of how a small settlement transformed into a superpower, and why, eventually, that giant collapsed. To understand the end, we must first look at the beginning. In the early days, Rome was ruled by kings. Some were wise, but the last was a tyrant. In 509 BC, the people of Rome did something revolutionary. They expelled their king and swore that no single man would ever hold absolute power over them again. They established a republic. In English history and law, the term republic comes from the Latin phrase res publica, which means the public thing, or the matter of the people. This was a government belonging to the citizens, not a private possession of a monarch. Listen closely to that word, republic. It represents a system where officials are chosen by the people. For the Romans, this was a matter of extreme pride. They created a complex system of checks and balances to ensure that power was shared. At the heart of this was the Senate, a body of experienced elders who advised the city's leaders. The leaders themselves were called consuls. Every year, 2 consuls were elected. They only served for 1 year, and they had the power to veto or stop each other's decisions. This veto power is a term we still use today in modern politics to describe the right to reject a proposal. In this era, the Roman character was defined by a concept called gravitas. This refers to a sense of seriousness, responsibility, and duty. A Roman citizen was expected to put the needs of the state above his own desires. For hundreds of years, this collective discipline allowed Rome to survive against all odds. When they were defeated in battle, they did not surrender. They simply raised more legions and went back to work. This quality of resilience, the ability to recover quickly from difficulties, is a key word to remember as we watch the empire grow and eventually fracture. The early republic was not a perfect democracy. It was a struggle between 2 classes, the patricians, who were the wealthy aristocrats, and the plebeians, the common people. Through a series of protests and political battles, the plebeians gained more rights, including their own representatives, called tribunes. This tension between different social classes fueled the city's growth. It forced the Romans to develop a sophisticated system of law that applied to everyone. They believed that law was the glue that held a society together. As the city grew, so did its territory. Rome began to conquer its neighbors, not because it started with a grand plan for an empire, but often because of a cycle of fear and defense. Each victory brought more land, more wealth, and more slaves. The small city on the hill was becoming a giant. But as the borders expanded, the very ideals that made the Republic strong began to stretch and tear. The soldiers who fought for Rome were originally farmer citizens. They left their plows to fight and returned to their fields after the campaign. But as wars became longer and took place further away, these farmers could not maintain their land. While they were away fighting for the glory of the Republic, wealthy landowners bought up their small farms, creating massive estates worked by prisoners of war. The brave soldiers returned home to find themselves homeless and unemployed. This shift created a dangerous gap between the rich and the poor. The civic virtue, the habit of putting the public good first, began to fade. It was replaced by greed and a hunger for individual power. The Senate, once a symbol of wisdom, became a fortress for the wealthy elite who refused to share their influence. We must ask ourselves a question that will haunt the rest of this journey. Can a government designed for a small city-state effectively rule a massive, diverse territory? Or does the weight of expansion inevitably lead to the death of freedom? The Romans were about to find out. In the next stage of our journey, we will see how the internal pressure of this success led to a series of violent clashes. We will meet the men who saw the cracks in the system and decided that the only way to save Rome, or perhaps to rule it, was to break the law. The era of the great generals was beginning. Before we move on, remember our key concepts. The Republic was built on shared power and the rule of law. It relied on resilience and gravitas. But as wealth flooded in, the balance of the res publica began to tilt. The very victories that made Rome the master of the Mediterranean were the same victories that planted the seeds of its internal decay. In the next part, we will witness the moment the Republic began to bleed, as brothers turned against brothers, and the streets of Rome saw political blood for the first time in centuries. The struggle for the soul of the city was about to turn deadly. The Roman Forum, the bustling heart of the city, was once a place of debate, law, and peaceful transition. But in the year 133 BC, the stones of the Forum were stained with the blood of a Roman official for the first time in centuries. Tiberius Gracchus, a man from a noble family who championed the rights of the poor, was beaten to death by a mob of angry senators and their followers. They used the legs of wooden benches as clubs. This event was a watershed moment in Roman history. In English, a watershed moment refers to a critical turning point that changes the course of events forever. When Tiberius was killed, a dangerous precedent was set. Listen for this word, precedent. It means an earlier action or event that is used as an example or guide for similar circumstances in the future. Once political violence was used to solve a disagreement, the old rules of the Republic began to crumble. The era of gravitas and shared duty was being replaced by an era of factionalism. A faction is a small group within a larger organization that often disagrees with the rest. Rome was now divided into two main factions: the Optimates, who wanted to keep all power in the Senate, and the Populares, who looked to the common people for support. As the political divide deepened, the very nature of the Roman military began to change. For centuries, only men who owned property could serve in the army. They were citizen soldiers who fought for their country. But as the empire grew, the wars became too large for this small group. A powerful general named Gaius Marius stepped forward with a solution that would have unintended consequences. He opened the army to the proletari, the poorest citizens who owned nothing. Marius promised these men a career, a salary, and most importantly, land when they retired. This changed everything. These new soldiers no longer felt a primary allegiance to the Roman state. Allegiance is a term for loyalty or commitment to a superior or a cause. Instead, Their allegiance was to their general. If the general won battles and grew rich, the soldiers grew rich too. This created what historians call client armies. The soldiers were now the clients or followers of a single powerful man rather than servants of the Republic. This shift led to a slow erosion of the Republic's foundations. Erosion is the gradual destruction or wearing away of something over time. The Senate still met, the consuls were still elected, and the laws were still read aloud. But the real power was moving away from the halls of government and into the military camps. The stage was set for a series of civil wars, wars fought between citizens of the same country. The first great clash of these client armies happened between Marius and his former deputy, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla was a man of the old aristocracy, and he believed the Senate must be supreme. When Marius tried to take a lucrative military command away from him, Sulla did something unthinkable. He turned his legions toward Rome itself. For the first time, a Roman general marched his own army into the city to seize power by force. When Sulla took control, he introduced proscriptions. These were lists of names posted in the forum. Anyone whose name appeared on the list was declared an enemy of the state. They could be killed by anyone, and their property would be confiscated by the government. This was state-sponsored terror. It was a brutal purge, the removal of people considered undesirable from an organization or place. Sulla eventually resigned his power and retired, hoping he had restored the Senate's authority. But he had actually shown everyone that the person with the most loyal soldiers was the true master of Rome. The Roman people watched in fear as the rule of law was replaced by the rule of the sword. The Republic was sick, and the medicine being offered was more violence. Amidst this chaos, a young man was rising through the ranks. He was a brilliant orator, a daring soldier, and a master of public relations. He had survived Sulla's purges by the skin of his teeth, and he had a vision for Rome that the Senate could not even imagine. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. Why did the Roman people allow their freedom to be traded for the security of a strong man? Was the Republic already dead before Caesar ever crossed the Rubicon? In our next section, we will follow Caesar's climb to the top, his gamble against the Senate, and the moment that changed the map of the world forever. The tension between the Senate's traditions and the general's ambitions was reaching a breaking point. The allegiance of the soldiers was the key. As we move forward, listen for how the word republic starts to lose its meaning, as one man begins to overshadow the entire state. A single river, shallow and narrow, stood between a general and his home. In the cold January of 49 BC, Julius Caesar stood on the banks of the Rubicon. To cross this stream with his army was a crime against the state. It was an act of treason. To stay was to face a humiliating trial in Rome. Caesar looked at his veterans, men who had followed him through the freezing forests of Gaul for 8 long years. He uttered the famous words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. With those words, he plunged his horse into the water. The Roman Republic would never be the same. Before this moment, Caesar had been part of a fragile alliance called the First Triumvirate. Listen for this word, triumvirate. It describes a group of 3 men holding power. Caesar, the ambitious politician, Pompey, the legendary general, and Crassus, the richest man in Rome, had joined forces to bypass the Senate. They were the power brokers of their day. But alliances built on ambition often collapse when the cement of shared interest dries up. Crassus died in a distant war, and Pompey, fearing Caesar's growing fame, turned back to the Senate for support. Caesar was a master populist. In English, a populist is a politician who claims to represent the interests of ordinary people against a corrupt elite. While he was away conquering Gaul, modern-day France, Caesar sent back detailed reports of his victories. He made sure the people of Rome knew his name and his generosity. He wasn't just a general, he was a celebrity. When the Senate ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, they were trying to strip him of his immunity. Immunity is a legal protection that prevents someone from being prosecuted for a crime. The civil war that followed the crossing of the Rubicon was a cataclysm. A cataclysm is a large-scale and violent event in the natural or political world. Caesar chased Pompey across the Mediterranean, eventually defeating him in Greece. When Caesar finally returned to Rome, he did not come as a consul or a temporary leader. He was appointed dictator in perpetuity. In the old days of the Republic, a dictator was a temporary official chosen during an emergency for only 6 months. By taking the title for life, Caesar effectively ended the Republic. He began a series of sweeping reforms. This means his changes were wide-ranging and affected many people. He reorganized the calendar, gave land to his veterans, and even granted Roman citizenship to people living in the provinces. To the poor, he was a hero. To the traditional senators, he was a tyrant. A tyrant is a cruel and oppressive ruler, or someone who has seized power illegally. They saw the Republic dying under the weight of one man's ego. The senators believed that, if they removed the man, they could restore the system. They formed a conspiracy led by Brutus and Cassius. On the 15th of March, known as the Ides of March, they struck. Caesar was stabbed 23 times in the shadow of a statue of his old rival, Pompey. This assassination, the murder of a prominent person for political reasons, was intended to bring back freedom. But the conspirators made a fatal miscalculation. A miscalculation is a mistake in judgment or strategy. They thought the people would celebrate the death of a dictator. Instead, the public was horrified. They saw the murder of a man who had provided them with bread and hope. Instead, it spiraled into even more bloodshed. The vacuum of power left by Caesar's death was a recipe for disaster. His young great-nephew, Octavian, and his top general, Mark Antony, rose up to avenge him. The Republic was now a ghost. The only question left was, who would wear the mask of the new master? We must consider a difficult truth. Can a society that has lost its civic spirit ever truly be free? The senators killed the dictator, but they couldn't kill the desire for a strong leader. He didn't just seize power, he disguised it. Listen for how Octavian transforms from a vengeful teenager into the most powerful man in the world. He would become the first emperor, a word that would come to define the Roman world for centuries. But did he save Rome, Or did he simply build a beautiful cage for its citizens? Imagine a teenager, pale and sickly, arriving in a city gripped by the chaos of a brutal murder. This was Octavian, the 18-year-old great-nephew of Julius Caesar. Most of the powerful men in Rome looked at him and saw a child. They thought he would be a pawn, a person used by others for their own purposes. But they were wrong. Octavian possessed a cold, calculating intelligence that would eventually outwit every general and senator in the Mediterranean. He didn't just want to avenge his uncle. He wanted to inherit his legacy. In English, a legacy is something that is handed down from a predecessor, such as a reputation, a fortune, or a position of power. To gain control, Octavian formed the Second Triumvirate with Mark Antony and Lepidus. Unlike the first alliance, this one was officially recognized by law. They spent years hunting down Caesar's assassins and dividing the Roman world between them. But as we have seen, three men cannot share a single throne for long. Eventually, Lepidus was forced into retirement, leaving a direct clash of titans between Octavian in the west and Mark Antony in the east. Antony had fallen in love with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. To the people of Rome, Octavian framed this not as a civil war between Romans, but as a war against a foreign queen who had bewitched a Roman general. This was a brilliant piece of propaganda. Propaganda is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote a particular political cause or point of view. Octavian made himself look like the defender of Roman tradition, while Antony looked like a traitor who had abandoned his culture. The final confrontation happened at sea. In 31 BC, at the Battle of Actium off the coast of Greece, Octavian's fleet crushed the forces of Antony and Cleopatra. This victory left Octavian as the sole master of the Roman world. He was now in a position that had killed his uncle. He knew that if he called himself a king or a dictator, the senators would eventually sharpen their knives again. He needed a different strategy. He needed to consolidate his power. To consolidate means to make something stronger or more solid by combining separate parts into a single whole. In 27 BC, Octavian did something counterintuitive, something that goes against common sense. He walked into the Senate and announced that he was giving all his powers back to the Republic. He told the senators that the wars were over and the Republic was restored. The senators, relieved and perhaps a bit confused, responded by giving him the title Augustus, which means the illustrious or the revered one. But this restoration was a facade. Listen to that word, facade. It is a deceptive outward appearance. While the Senate still met and consuls were still elected, Augustus held all the real power. He controlled the army, the grain supply, and the provinces. He didn't call himself a king. Instead, he chose the title princeps, which means first citizen. This is why historians call this period the Principate. It was a monarchy disguised as a republic. Under the rule of Augustus, Rome entered a new era called the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. This was a period of relative stability and prosperity that would last for nearly 200 years. The endless civil wars that had plagued the city for a century finally stopped. Augustus famously bragged that he found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble. He built new roads, grand temples, and massive public buildings. He created the first permanent firefighting force and a professional police force for the city. He also established the Praetorian Guard, an elite unit of soldiers whose only job was to protect the person of the emperor. This created a new kind of stability, but it also created a new danger. The Roman people accepted this trade-off. They traded their political freedom for the status quo. Most people preferred a peaceful life under a clever master to a violent life in a dying republic. But a question remained. What happens when the master is no longer clever? What happens when a system built on the personality of one man falls into the hands of someone cruel or incompetent? Augustus had spent his life building a seamless transition for his successors. But power has a way of corrupting even the most carefully built systems. As we move forward, we will see how the Pax Romana flourished under the good emperors, but also how the bloodline of Caesar produced men whose names would become synonyms for madness and cruelty. How did the empire manage to thrive even when its leaders were failing? And what was life really like for the millions of people living under the shadow of the Roman eagle? In the next part, we will explore the height of Roman glory and the cracks that were beginning to appear beneath the golden surface. The Roman world was now a single, breathing organism, stretching from the rainy woods of Britain to the burning sands of the Sahara. At its peak, nearly 1 in every 4 people on Earth lived under the rule of the Roman emperor. This was the heart of the Pax Romana. It was a time when a merchant could travel from one end of the empire to the other using a single currency, speaking a common language, and protected by a single set of laws. But what was life actually like for the millions of people living in this metropolis? Ancient Rome was the first city in history to reach a population of 1 million people. It was a place of incredible contrast. There were gleaming marble temples and shaded colonnades for the wealthy, but just a few streets away, the poor lived in insulae. These were cramped, multi-story apartment buildings made of wood and cheap brick. They were prone to fires and frequent collapses. Despite these dangers, the city was a marvel of infrastructure. The Romans were the master builders of the ancient world. They constructed thousands of miles of paved roads, many of which still exist today. They built massive aqueducts, stone channels that used gravity to carry fresh water from distant mountains into the heart of the city. This allowed Romans to enjoy public baths and running water, luxuries that wouldn't be seen again on such a scale for over 1,000 years. The Roman integration of conquered people was one of their greatest strengths. Unlike many other empires, Rome eventually offered citizenship to the people it conquered. If you served in the army or contributed to the local government, you could become a Roman citizen. This gave people a stake in the system. They weren't just subjects of a distant king, they were part of a global civilization. For a long time, the empire was blessed with a series of capable leaders known as the 5 good emperors. These men, including Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius, were not chosen because of their bloodline. Instead, each emperor adopted his successor based on talent and experience. This was a form of meritocracy. Under these men, the empire reached its maximum size and its highest level of prosperity. Trajan was a great conqueror who expanded the borders to their limit. Hadrian was a builder who traveled to every corner of his realm, ordering the construction of walls and cities to consolidate the frontier. Marcus Aurelius was a philosopher king who spent his nights writing meditations on duty and virtue, while spending his days defending the borders from invading tribes. He represented the Roman ideal of gravitas in an age of absolute power. But even during this golden age, there were undercurrents of trouble. The Roman economy was heavily dependent on constant expansion. Every time they conquered a new land, they brought back gold and slaves. But once the borders stopped moving, the flow of new wealth began to stagnate. Furthermore, the imperial system had a deep structural flaw. While the 5 good emperors chose their successors based on merit, Marcus Aurelius broke this tradition. He chose his own son, Commodus. This decision would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. Commodus was not a philosopher or a soldier. He was a vain and cruel man who cared more about fighting as a gladiator than ruling an empire. His reign marked the end of the Pax Romana and the beginning of a long, painful decline. We must pause and reflect. If a system depends entirely on the character of one man at the top, how can it ever be truly stable? The Romans had moved from a republic where laws were king to an empire where the emperor was the law. They had traded their political voice for peace and bread. But as the bread and circuses became more expensive and the leaders became more erratic, the price of that peace began to rise. In the next part of our story, we will witness the moment the Golden Age shattered. We will see what happens when the army realizes it has more power than the Senate, and when the borders of the empire begin to smoke with the fires of invasion. The crisis was coming, and it would push the Roman world to the very edge of collapse. As we move forward, listen for how the word stability starts to disappear from the Roman vocabulary. The empire was about to enter a century of chaos that would change the face of Europe and the Mediterranean forever. Could any leader, no matter how strong, hold back the tide of history? Imagine the most powerful seat in the world being auctioned off like a piece of old furniture. In the year 193 AD, that is exactly what happened. The Praetorian Guard, the very men hired to protect the leader, murdered the sitting ruler and announced that the highest bidder would become the next master of Rome. This moment signaled the beginning of a terrifying period known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. It was a time of anarchy. For the next 50 years, the Roman world was a revolving door of leaders. Historians call them the barracks emperors. These men were not politicians or philosophers. They were generals who were declared emperors by their own troops. Most of them lasted only a few months or years before being assassinated by their own soldiers or killed in battle by a rival. This crisis of succession meant that Rome was constantly at war with itself. While the generals fought for the crown, the fabric of society began to unravel. One of the biggest threats wasn't a barbarian army, but a hidden enemy: inflation. To pay their demanding soldiers, emperors began the debasement of the currency. The Romans took their silver coins, the denarius, and mixed them with cheaper metals like copper. At the start of the empire, a coin was almost pure silver. By the end of this crisis, it was less than 5% silver. People realized their money was worthless. Merchants raised prices, trade slowed to a crawl, and the middle class of the empire was wiped out. The economy was in a downward spiral. The borders were now porous. Germanic tribes in the north and the Persian Empire in the east saw Rome's internal weakness as an invitation. They began to plunder Roman cities. To plunder means to steal goods from a place or person, typically using force, and in a time of war or civil disorder. The empire was so precarious, not securely held or in position, that it actually split into 3 pieces. A breakaway empire formed in the west and another in the east, centered in the city of Palmyra. It looked as though the Roman world was finally ready for its collapse. Many people living at the time believed they were witnessing the end of civilization itself. However, Rome was not finished yet. From the ranks of the military rose a series of tough-as-nails generals who were determined to stitch the pieces back together. They were men who had grown up in the camps and knew nothing but war. They began a process of restoration. To restore means to bring something back to its former condition or position. But this restored Rome would look very different from the Rome of Augustus. To survive, the state had to become a military machine. The freedom of the individual was sacrificed for the survival of the collective. The government became more authoritarian. In English, authoritarian describes a government that demands total obedience to authority at the expense of personal freedom. We must ask, if a civilization survives by turning into a prison, has it really been saved? The crisis had broken the spirit of the Pax Romana. The people were no longer citizens of a great republic. They were subjects of a divine ruler. In our next segment, we will meet the man who tried to fix the empire by cutting it in half. We will see how a new capital rose in the east, and how a new religion began to spread through the Roman streets like wildfire. The division of Rome was about to become official, and the consequences would last for 1,000 years. Listen for how the word emperor changes from a title of a first citizen to the title of a living god. The old world was dying, and a new, more mysterious era was about to begin. The Roman Empire was like a giant crumbling house that had been through a hurricane. It was still standing, but the roof was leaking and the walls were cracked. To save the structure, a man named Diocletian stepped forward in 284 AD. He was a soldier of humble origins who realized that the empire had become unwieldy. In English, unwieldy describes something that is difficult to move or manage because of its size, shape, or weight. Diocletian's solution was radical. He decided to cut the empire in half. He created a system called the Tetrarchy. Listen for this word, Tetrarchy. It comes from the Greek words for rule of 4. He appointed a co-emperor to rule the West while he ruled the East, and both had a junior emperor to assist them. This wasn't a division of the empire into 2 separate countries yet, but a way to share the administrative burden. Diocletian also transformed the role of the emperor. He discarded the old title of princeps, or first citizen. Instead, he wanted to be called dominus, which means lord. He dressed in silk robes and required everyone to prostrate themselves before him. This created a new hierarchy. A hierarchy is a system in which members of a society are ranked according to relative status or authority. The Roman leader was no longer a politician. he was a distant, godlike figure protected by a massive bureaucracy. A bureaucracy is a system of government in which most of the important decisions are made by state officials rather than by elected representatives. To pay for this massive government and the enlarged army, Diocletian overhauled the tax system. He made professions hereditary. If your father was a baker, you had to be a baker. This provided stability, but it also took away the social mobility that had once made Rome vibrant. Social mobility is the ability of individuals or groups to move within a social hierarchy. After Diocletian retired, his system of 4 rulers quickly collapsed into more civil war. From the smoke emerged a leader who would change the course of world history: Constantine the Great. Constantine is famous for 2 pivotal decisions. Pivotal means of crucial importance in relation to the development or success of something else. The first was his conversion to Christianity. Listen for that word, conversion. It refers to the act of changing one's religion or beliefs. Before a major battle at the Milvian Bridge, Constantine claimed to have seen a vision of a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign you shall conquer." He won the battle and subsequently issued the Edict of Milan. An edict is an official order or decree issued by a person in authority. This decree ended the state-sponsored persecution of Christians. Persecution is the ill treatment of someone, especially because of their race or political or religious beliefs. By supporting Christianity, Constantine gave the empire a new, unifying force. He saw that the old pagan gods were losing their grip on the people's hearts. A single god and a single church could provide a new mandate for a single emperor. Constantine's second pivotal decision was to move the capital of the empire. He realized that the city of Rome was too far from the dangerous eastern frontiers and the wealthy trade routes of the Levant. He chose an ancient Greek city called Byzantium and rebuilt it as a New Rome. It was later renamed Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. This city was a fortress. It was surrounded on 3 sides by water and protected by massive walls. For the first time in history, the center of gravity of the Roman world shifted from Italy to the east. Constantinople became the most sophisticated and wealthy city in Europe. It was a beacon of culture and trade. But as the East began to flourish, the West was left vulnerable. While Constantinople grew rich behind its walls, the old city of Rome was left to face the growing pressure of migrating tribes and a failing economy alone. Was the division of the empire a masterstroke of survival, or was it a death sentence for the West? To a person living in 330 AD, the empire seemed stronger than it had been in a century. But beneath the surface, the 2 halves were drifting apart. They spoke different languages, Latin in the West and Greek in the East. They had different interests and different enemies. In the next part, we will see how the pressure on the borders finally reached a breaking point. We will witness the arrival of the Huns, the desperate flight of the Goths, and the moment a Roman emperor was killed on the battlefield by the very people he had tried to control. The fall was no longer a distant fear. It was becoming a daily reality. Listen for the word migrant as we explore how the movement of people across the borders changed the face of the empire forever. The final act of the Western Empire was about to begin. The Danube River was the edge of the world. On one side lay the stone cities, paved roads, and organized laws of the Roman Empire. On the other side lay the dark, trackless forests of Germania. For centuries, this water had been a barrier, a fence that kept the chaos of the north away from the peace of the south. But in the year 376 AD, the barrier did not just break, it vanished. Thousands of people, cold, hungry, and terrified, gathered on the northern bank. They were not an invading army, they were refugees. Listen for this word, refugee. In English, a refugee is a person who has been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution, or natural disaster. These people were the Goths, and they were fleeing from a nightmare. Out of the vast steppes of Central Asia, a new and terrifying force had appeared: the Huns. Historians of the time described the Huns as scarcely human, a nomadic people who lived on horseback and fought with a speed and ferocity that the Romans had never seen before. Ferocity means the state of being frighteningly cruel or violent. The Goths begged the Roman Emperor Valens for asylum. Asylum is a term for protection granted by a nation to someone who has left their native country as a political refugee. Valens saw an opportunity. He needed more soldiers for his armies and more farmers to pay taxes. He granted them permission to cross the river and settle inside the empire. But what was intended to be a peaceful integration quickly turned into a humanitarian disaster. The Roman officials in charge of the crossing were corrupt and greedy. Instead of providing the food and land the emperor had promised, they hoarded the supplies. They forced the starving Goths to sell their children into slavery just for a piece of dog meat. This was an atrocity. An atrocity is an extremely wicked or cruel act, typically one involving physical violence or injury. Driven to desperation, a state of despair that results in rash or extreme behavior, the Goths did the only thing they could. They picked up their swords and revolted. The Roman army, once the most disciplined force on earth, was no longer what it used to be. It was filled with mercenaries. A mercenary is a professional soldier hired to serve in a foreign army. Many of these mercenaries were actually Goths themselves. The empire was now fighting a war against the very people it had hired to protect it. In 378 AD, the two sides met at the Battle of Adrianople. It was a hot, dusty August day. The Roman legions were exhausted from marching in the sun. The Goths, fueled by indignation, anger or annoyance provoked by what is perceived as unfair treatment, crushed the Roman lines. By sunset, 2/3 of the Roman army lay dead. Among them was the Emperor Valens himself. His body was never found. This was a catastrophe for Rome. It means an event causing great and often sudden damage or suffering. For the first time in centuries, a Roman emperor had been killed by a barbarian force on Roman soil. The aura of invincibility was gone. The defeat at Adrianople changed the power dynamic of the Western Empire forever. The Romans could no longer force the Goths to leave. Instead, they had to allow them to settle as an independent nation. The empire was now a house divided. The newcomers kept their own leaders, their own laws, and their own weapons. They were a state within a state, Why did the Roman leadership fail so badly at this critical moment? Was it just incompetence, the inability to do something successfully, or was the system itself too broken? The refugee crisis had turned into a military invasion, and the Roman heartland was now open. A Gothic leader named Alaric, who had once fought for the Romans, would lead his people to the gates of the eternal city itself. We will witness the moment the world stood still, the sack of Rome. The collapse was no longer a theory. It was a sound, the sound of heavy wooden gates being smashed open. Can a city that conquered the world survive when it can no longer defend its own walls? For 800 years, no foreign enemy had marched through the streets of Rome. The city was considered invincible, too powerful to be defeated or overcome. People across the Mediterranean believed that as long as Rome stood, the world stood. But on a dark night in August 410 AD, that belief was shattered. The Salarian Gate was opened from the inside, and the Goths, led by Alaric, poured into the city. This was the first sack of Rome. In a historical context, a sack is the looting and destruction of a captured city. The Goths did not burn the city to the ground, but they stripped it of its gold, its silver, and its prestige. The psychological shock was greater than the physical damage. In far-off Bethlehem, a scholar named Jerome wrote, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." People began to ask a terrifying question. If the eternal city could fall, what hope was there for anyone else? The fall of the city was the result of a long siege. A siege is a military operation in which enemy forces surround a town or building, cutting off essential supplies. Rome had been starved for months. The people were eating bread made of sawdust. The government, which had moved to the swampy, well-defended city of Ravenna, did almost nothing to help. This disconnection between the ruling elite and the suffering people was a major factor in the empire's unraveling. As the Goths moved on, a new and even more destructive group appeared: the Vandals. They had crossed the Rhine, marched through Spain, and conquered North Africa. In 455 AD, they sailed across the sea and sacked Rome again. They were so thorough in their looting that their name gave us the modern English word, vandalism. The Vandals didn't just take the gold, they stripped the lead from the roofs of temples and the bronze from the statues. During this time of despair, a terrifying figure emerged from the east: Attila the Hun. He was known as the Scourge of God. A scourge is a person or thing that causes great trouble or suffering. Attila led a massive confederation of nomadic tribes that struck deep into the heart of Gaul and Italy. He didn't want to live in the empire. He wanted to extort it. Rome was only saved from Attila by a brilliant general named Aetius, often called the last of the Romans. Aetius had grown up among the Huns and knew their tactics. He managed to pull together a fragile alliance of Romans and Germanic tribes to stop Attila at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. It was a rare moment of Roman unity in an age of fragmentation. But the victory was short-lived. The Roman government was now a shadow of its former self. The emperors were often children or puppets controlled by powerful Germanic generals. The real power lay with the warlords. A warlord is a military leader who exercises local civil power by force. The logistics of the empire were also failing. Logistics refers to the detailed coordination of a complex operation. The roads were no longer safe for merchants. The taxes were no longer being collected because the wealthy landowners had built their own private fortresses and refused to pay. The centralized government was losing its grip. The Western Empire was like a dying fire. The flames were flickering out, one province at a time. Britain was abandoned. Spain was lost. Gaul was divided. Italy was exhausted. The Roman identity was being replaced by local loyalties. People no longer felt like Romans. They felt like members of a specific tribe or followers of a specific general. In our final section, we will witness the quiet, almost unnoticed moment when the last emperor was pushed off his throne. We will analyze the catalysts for this final collapse. Was it disease, lead poisoning, or simply the weight of history? And finally, we will ask why the Roman legacy continues to haunt our modern world. The end of the Roman story is not just about a single battle. It is about the erosion of an idea. Listen for how the word collapse describes not a sudden crash, but a slow, heavy sinking into the ground. The end of the Western Roman Empire did not come with a massive explosion or a final heroic stand. It ended with a quiet conversation in a palace in Ravenna. In the year 476 AD, a Germanic general named Odoacer decided he had seen enough. He did not want to be a puppet master anymore. He walked into the chambers of the last Western emperor, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer did not kill the boy. He simply sent him into retirement and sent the imperial insignia, the symbols of power like the crown and the purple robe, to the emperor in the east. With that simple gesture, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. This event is known as the deposition of the last emperor. In English, a deposition is the action of removing someone from a position of power. It was the final catalyst in a process that had been building for centuries. While 476 AD is the date we find in history books, the collapse was actually a long, slow disintegration. Why did the greatest superpower of the ancient world finally break? Historians have debated this for over 1,000 years, but most agree it was a perfect storm of factors. First, we must look at the military. Rome had become too dependent on foederati. These were barbarian tribes who were paid to fight for Rome. These soldiers realized if they had swords, they didn't need to take orders from a weak emperor. The army had become barbarized, losing the discipline and allegiance that had once made the legions invincible. Second, the economy had completely depleted its resources. Without new conquests, the flow of gold and slaves stopped. To pay for the massive army and the bloated bureaucracy, the government squeezed the citizens with crippling taxes. Small farmers couldn't pay, so they fled to the estates of wealthy lords, becoming serfs. This was the beginning of the feudal system that would define the Middle Ages. The middle class vanished, and with it, the tax base that supported the state. Third, we cannot ignore the biological factor. Disease played a silent but devastating role in the fall of Rome. The Antonine Plague, and later the Plague of Cyprian, wiped out millions of people. These pandemics reduced the population, meaning fewer soldiers to guard the borders and fewer farmers to grow food. Some historians even suggest that lead poisoning from the city's water pipes slowly weakened the minds of the Roman elite, though this remains a controversial theory. Finally, there was a failure of leadership. The system Augustus built required a strong, intelligent emperor at the center. But by the end, the throne was occupied by children, cowards, and figureheads. While the West was falling, the Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, continued to flourish. It would survive for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire, a remnant of Roman glory. But did Rome really fall? In many ways, it simply transformed. The Latin language did not die. It evolved into Italian, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. Roman law became the foundation for the legal systems of the modern world. The Christian Church, which had once been persecuted by Rome, adopted the empire's administrative structure and became the most powerful institution in Europe. The Republic was gone, but its ideas about citizenship and government would lie dormant for centuries, only to be resurrected during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. As we look back on this journey, from the mud huts on the Tiber to the marble halls of the Caesars, we see a cycle of human ambition. We see how resilience built a superpower, how greed divided it, and how complacency eventually destroyed it. The Romans thought their world would last forever. They were wrong. The story of Rome is a mirror for our own time. It teaches us that civilization is fragile. It requires constant care, a shared sense of duty, and leaders who put the public thing, the res publica, above their own interests. The legacy of Rome is all around us, in our buildings, our laws, and the very words we speak. Thank you for joining us on this epic journey through the London Gritty Chronicles. We have traveled through centuries of triumph and tragedy, learning the language of history along the way. Remember, history is not just about the past. It is a map for the future. Keep practicing your English, keep questioning the world around you, and never forget the lessons of the Eternal City.